I've now learned that kind of where do you see yourself in 10 years is a very standard interview question, but I wasn't expecting it when I interviewed here at Birmingham. And if I had had time to think, I would have thought, well, what do they want me to say? Well, here as a professor. But I thought, I kind of on the spot, without thinking, I kind of said, here as a professor, being extremely optimistic. And that's how it's worked out. And yeah, I couldn't have asked for more. So thank you, everybody, very much indeed. With that out of the way, let's talk about some ways and some whys, which is, I guess, what you came for. Let's find out. So what I've been doing the whole time since I started thinking about philosophy was to try to do metaphysics, well, philosophy in general, metaphysics in particular, in a way which harmonizes with science, which is continuous with science, which meshes with our best science, whichever way you want to put it. I want to do metaphysics, kind of study of reality in its most general aspects, in a way that made proper reference to science and the enormous discoveries it has made and continues to make. We shouldn't be doing philosophy in a vacuum from the progress of science. Philosophy never has been done in a vacuum from the progress of science, at least not for a long time. But I've tried to do metaphysics in a way which draws on science perhaps a bit more extensively and a bit more deeply than some of the prevailing strains of metaphysics around at the moment do. And so when you really take seriously this idea that metaphysics and science are both parts of the kind of single larger enterprise of finding out about the world we live in, that has consequences both for our conception of science and for our conception of metaphysics. So it expands what science can be seen as doing. Science isn't just about kind of counting the things that there are in the world, giving them names and enumerating their behaviors. It can help us to understand the underlying natures, the essences of things, to use an old philosophical term, that philosophy is often kind of kept as its kind of own kingdom. And so it allows science to be more flexible as well. So rather than just kind of giving it more power to affect kind of larger parts of our worldview, this approach can let scientific theories import whatever metaphysical principles they like or they need in order to make themselves as strong as they can be. So the idea is that instead of doing kind of science against a fixed background philosophy, you can kind of pick and choose like bits of theory in science and bits of theory in metaphysics to make the best overall package. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. But the consequences for metaphysics are perhaps even more obvious and even more radical. If the view that I'm going to describe is right, then things we've been talking about for a really long time, alternative possibilities, alternative ways the world really could go, those things will turn out to be quantum mechanical in nature. And that's not something we would ever have expected. No one would ever have expected 5,000 years ago that kind of the early concept of alternative possibilities would turn out to be quantum. They hadn't any idea what quantum mechanics was. But in the same way that water has turned out to be a chemical compound or a mixture of chemical compounds, and we had no idea that that was going to be the way things turned out. So the idea is our discoveries in science can extend to philosophy, and science can tell us kind of what these traditional philosophical objects like alternative possibilities or causes and effects, what they really are in terms which meshes with the best science. So there's a kind of big constructive project that I'm going to be describing that puts together ingredients from kind of lots of bits of my previous work going back about 15 years in total. And I think I have a reasonably kind of well worked out understanding of the way those pieces fit together. But there's one piece of the puzzle which I'm mystified by. And so I'm going to finish with what I take to be a problem, and maybe a problem that I'll spend some of the next 10 years trying to resolve. This is the problem of the puzzle of non-causal dependence, which I'll talk about at the end. So here's the plan. I'll start by talking about this idea of taking a scientific approach to metaphysics in a bit more detail. Then I'll sketch a positive theory that you can develop if you follow that line. It's a theory of contingency, and it's a quantum theory of contingency. So contingency, this idea that philosophers have played with, quantum mechanics, the theory that physicists have played with, we're using quantum mechanics to help understand contingency. And that theory can be extended, and this work is work in progress, and I don't have all the I's dotted and T's crossed on it yet, but I have confidence that we can give a good account of causation and causal explanation using the same sort of theory that I'll describe, extending that theory to account for causation. But then I'm going to present this puzzle that I want to kind of face you with. The puzzle of how scientific explanation can hold in the domain of the non-contingent. How it is that when kind of two features of reality are necessarily connected, nonetheless there can be an explanation there in one direction and not the other. And I'll talk about two possible solutions to this puzzle. They're kind of, each of them is radical, and they're at kind of opposite extremes. And some days I wake up and want to go one way, some days I want to go the other. I'll describe both of these, and you can decide which one you like the sound of most. So, what is metaphysics? What does it mean to do it in a scientific way? So metaphysics, I've already described it as the study of the most general aspects of reality. And that leaves open what reality is like. So kind of whatever reality is actually like, the most general aspects of it are whatever metaphysics studies. And reality is something that we can also study using science. And anything that we kind of learn about the world from science is something that philosophy should accommodate. This is a kind of very basic kind of thesis. This is from Catherine Hawley about 15 years ago. Kind of characteristically kind of straightforward and sensible kind of point. All our beliefs should be empirically adequate. That is to say, all of our beliefs should be compatible with our best empirical data. Should make predictions for what is observable that's compatible with what we in fact see. And that applies to all beliefs, applies to metaphysical beliefs. So metaphysical beliefs, they're part of the total story by which we predict and explain the world around us. Here's a way more radical line on the connection between science and metaphysics from a similar period by James Ladyman and Don Ross in this polemical book, Everything Must Go. It's a largely anti-metaphysics book, so we should kind of get rid of most of metaphysics and replace most of it with scientific reasoning. And they have an extremely narrow prescribed role for metaphysics that they envisage. The only metaphysics we should take seriously is metaphysics that helps to unify kind of existing scientific theories. And I think this is a good role for metaphysics to play, but I think it's too narrow. There's a bit more than just unification that metaphysics can do. This is getting closer to the kind of attitude I adopt from Craig Callender. He's criticizing the kind of philosophy that is guided by intuitions or kind of beliefs about what is conceivable in particular. Intuitions about possibility that derive from claims about what we can conceive or not conceive. So he says the only way to weed out like the good intuitive beliefs from the bad intuitive beliefs is to see what results from a comprehensive theory that actually tries to model the actual world. And here the word I want to put the emphasis on is comprehensive. It's comprehensive in that it doesn't shy away from answering any questions, whether scientific or metaphysical. And that is to say, what we need to do is to come up with complete theories that will answer the scientific questions and the metaphysical questions in a way that fits together, harmonizes, is unified. And this has a kind of straightforward epistemic consequence. And so, I mean, I'm not going to talk about isms very much. I'm going to try to avoid it. But I just want to distinguish these two views, a kind of the basic view and the more radical view. This is that the basic view, naturalism about metaphysics, says that truths which we learn from natural science are evidentially relevant to some metaphysical hypotheses. That is to say that sometimes, if we get some evidence by doing science, it can make a metaphysical hypothesis more plausible or less plausible. It can bear on it. It can be epistemically or evidentially relevant to it. That is to say, metaphysics and science aren't kind of operating independently of each other when it comes to evidence. There can be evidence from metaphysical claims from science. There can be evidence from scientific claims from metaphysics. But here I'm just focusing on the direction science to metaphysics. So if we have it that some of our scientific claims evidentially bear on some metaphysical claims, that could be compatible with a very modest relevance. There's only a very few metaphysical claims that have any scientific evidence bearing on them, and that scientific evidence only bears a tiny little bit. But the radical view says it's not like that. Like, this evidential bearing of scientific claims goes throughout metaphysics. There's no bit of metaphysics which is wholly isolated from or independent of evidence from natural science. And if you have a Quine-style holist or holistic epistemology, that would provide you a potential route to get from the basic version to the radical version. This is really for the epistemologists in the room. This is the kind of picture that I have in mind. And it is quite a Quinean approach for those of you who know the work of Quine. Though Quine wouldn't have used this phrase package deal, I don't think. The idea is that we're trying to produce total theories of the nature of reality, total theories of what reality is like, not leaving anything out. And when we try and do that, we're going to come up with a total theory that has some components that we traditionally would have thought of as scientific, some components we traditionally would have thought of as metaphysical. But when we're trying to make the best package deal, we don't want to hold like one of those halves fixed and just then vary the other half to find the best outcome. We want to be able to vary both halves to find the best like total combined view. And so sometimes we might want to tweak some features of a scientific theory so that it fits better with metaphysics. Sometimes we might want to tweak some metaphysical theory we have so it fits better with some new scientific discovery. There's an asymmetry here, though. And to this extent, I think natural science is in a much stronger evidential situation than philosophy is. It's pretty hard to come up with something which is uncontroversially a discovery in philosophy. Every now and then it's maybe like conclusively demonstrated that a certain approach isn't going to work. Maybe there's a logical inconsistency discovered in an attempted foundation for logic or something like that, and that whole project is written off. Even then, those projects are often resuscitated in ingenious ways. Very few theories ever are completely abandoned in philosophy. Maybe you think that's bad news for philosophy. But I think the reason is that we just don't have a lot of independent evidence for our theories in metaphysics that kind of is independent of all the rest of our worldview, including the scientific stuff. Whereas I take it that we do have quite a lot of evidence in the scientific domain which is much more independent of our theories in metaphysics than vice versa. So there's a kind of evidential asymmetry here. Science has just got a much stronger evidential footing than metaphysics. So all of the other things being equal, if we're having to build the best package deal by adjusting both of them, we're probably going to want to make bigger and more frequent adjustments in our metaphysical theories than we do in our scientific theories because of this stronger evidential basis, independent evidential basis that science has. So in principle, science can get tweaked to fit with metaphysics. Metaphysics can get tweaked to fit with science. But in practice, I think there's often going to be a much stronger case for tweaking the metaphysics than there is for tweaking the science. So that was all at quite a high level of abstraction. The kind of message is, science and philosophy shouldn't continue in isolation. Scientists and philosophers should talk to each other. They should develop their theories with input from each other, and they shouldn't scientists shouldn't hold fixed some background philosophy as completely unquestioned and sacrosanct, nor should philosophers work with a crude or oversimplified caricature of science. So, that all sounds like things we can probably agree on most of the time. It's going to get a little weirder now. And this is going to be maybe something that's it's not going to be so easy for people to accept. So here are the ways that I was talking about. What is a way for things to be? One possibility and another possibility being alternatives. I can be standing up or lying down, but I can't be doing both at the same time. So one way for me to be is for me to be standing up. One way for things to be is for me to be lying down. Now imagine that these things get scaled up to the level of whole universes. So we're thinking about ways for the whole universe to be. All the galaxies, all the stars, everything in our physical universe. So these are things that philosophers have called possible worlds, kind of complete ways things could be that are complete in every detail. And this view I'm going to describe is a realist view about possible worlds. It says there are possible worlds. These things, complete ways for things to be, they do really exist. They're out there in reality. So that's a view that philosophers have called modal realism. And in particular, it's what some people call concrete modal realism, because those worlds that are out there, our world is a complete way for things to be, but there are other complete ways for things to be as well. And those things are just more worlds like ours. So we have our universe, which is like the complete whole story about our universe is one way for things to be. But there are lots of others, and they're just as real, just as solid as ours. They're just not ours. We're in this one and we're not in those. And what are these things, these complete, solid physical universes? According to this view that I've defended in this book, they are the many worlds of many worlds quantum theory. They're the parallel worlds of the quantum multiverse. So what is Everettian quantum mechanics, the many worlds theory? This is an approach to quantum theory, first suggested in 1957, which gets rid of the idea of the collapse of the quantum wave function. The quantum wave function never collapses on this view, it just spreads out a lot. And it spreads out into whole different worlds, into whole different world-shaped regions. So a lot of what you might traditionally associate with quantum theory isn't weird about this view. There isn't any special role for consciousness in causing collapse of the wave function, because there is no collapse of the wave function. There isn't any kind of extra hidden particle positions that we can never detect. There's just the quantum wave function. And so where you have these kind of notorious superpositions, kind of Schrödinger's cat being half alive and half dead, this is a kind of weird sounding situation, the many worlds scenario makes it much simpler sounding. Instead of there being one cat in this weird half alive, half dead state, you just have two cats. One cat's alive, one cat's dead. Each cat is a perfectly ordinary cat in a perfectly ordinary state. So the weirdness is not in the state of a single weird thing. The weirdness is just that now we've got a lot more worlds than we thought. And it's maybe difficult to accept that there's that many worlds out there, but they are worlds of just the same kind as the worlds we already have. And there are lots of things to like about this view. It has lots of physics advantages. It doesn't involve new mechanisms which give you problems with relativity, and it can be applied straightforwardly to quantum cosmology when there's no external observer, unlike approaches to quantum mechanics that rely on an external observer. So, two ways to think about the many worlds interpretation. Splitting way, or overlap way, or a parallel worlds way, or divergence way. And I'm going to advise you to think about many worlds in the second sort of way. When there's multiple worlds all along, and they might match up to some time and then cease to match afterwards. But they never actually overlap completely. So it's not that there's one world which splits into two. There's two worlds all along. They just match perfectly up to some point and cease to match perfectly after that point. Here's another picture of the same thing. We don't have one kind of tendrillous, dendritic branching object. Instead, we have these nice separate parallel worlds, each of which looks pretty much like we thought a universe should look. So then, how is this relevant to metaphysics? Well, it's relevant because it gives an account of contingency, of the different ways things could be. So the basic core of the account is that contingency is variation across the parallel worlds. Some things are kind of true wherever you go in the multiverse. 1 + 1 = 2. That's true at every quantum parallel world. But other things vary. Whether I made it to the lecture, or whether I got hit by a bus this morning. Those things vary from world to world. Not everybody makes it to their inaugural lecture. And so that is what it is for it to be contingent, whether I make it to my inaugural lecture, for there to be people just like me who didn't make it to their inaugural lecture in their world. It's because things are a certain way with them, they didn't make it, that things could have been that way with me. So it's kind of vicarious. These possibilities, for me, are had vicariously in virtue of things that really happen to other people out there. So this is a pretty radical view, as you've probably observed. So fundamental reality is not going to be contingent, because the multiverse is just the multiverse. There's only one way that could be. So when you look at the totality of everything according to this view, that totality of everything could not have been different. And all the facts about it are necessary. But at the level of the individual worlds and perspectives embedded in the individual worlds, there we have contingency. Because each individual world, the inhabitants in that, from their point of view, could have been in another world. And so the contingency comes in at the level of systems embedded inside a world. There's no contingency at the biggest level of all the worlds taken together. So the laws of nature that govern that whole plurality of worlds, they're deterministic, and that whole physical reality is non-contingent. But what our world is like is contingent, because it's contingent where in this huge plurality of worlds we happen to be. So one thing I haven't told you yet about all these worlds is that they have what is in mathematical terms a measure defined over them. So these are the branch weights. Think of these as kind of a weighting on each world. Some of them are kind of stronger or heavier or more substantial than others. And these things work just like probabilities mathematically. And the claim that Everettians make, or at least the claim that I make, is that they are probabilities. Objective probabilities of the kind that philosophers sometimes call chances. So where there's like a chance in the world of, you roll a die and there's a chance of 1/6 of it coming up a 6, ultimately what that traces back to is that in 1/6 of the worlds by weight in which you roll that die, it comes up 6. In 5/6 of the worlds by weight, it comes up something other than 6. And that would be true as a matter of these probabilities, not as a matter of just sheer number of branches. It's not that there's all the branches have equal likelihood. Some of them are more likely than others. But if we just have this space of possible worlds and these probability measures, what is there around for these probabilities to be probabilities of? I mean, after all, we already observed that the whole of the multiverse, all of these worlds taken together, are non-contingent. It's non-contingent. Well, I've already alluded to it. What's contingent on this view is which world we're in, which world is ours. So compare the word actual with here and now. Here first. Nobody thinks that there's one place which is really, truly here, and everybody else is wrong about which place is here. Like, in fact, this place is here, and if you guys think that where you are is here, from your point of view, you're wrong, because here is here. That's not the way the word here works. It refers to wherever the speaker is, roughly. And B-theorists about time, to use the metaphysical lingo, say the same thing about now. They say there's nothing special about the present moment. It just happens to be the moment that we're at. It's no more real or more vivid than any of the other moments. They're all now from their own perspective, just like every place is here from its own perspective, or from the perspective of somebody that's at it. And in the same way, I want to say, actual is a word that refers to whatever world you're in. So every world is actual for its own inhabitants. And now all contingency is contingency about which world is actual, ultimately. And so here we have it. Each Everett world is a distinct way for things to be. And we found out what these elusive object ways for things to be are. At least we've got a candidate for what this thing, a way for things to be, is. And compare again to the discovery that water is H2O, or a mixture of chemicals that's kind of largely H2O. We knew what water was. We've known what water was for tens of thousands of years. We didn't know what it really was, in the sense that we didn't know that it really was H2O. On this view, in the same sort of way, we've known what alternative possibilities are. We've been dealing with them for tens of thousands of years. We didn't know that they really were these quantum parallel worlds. So it's a surprising discovery about the nature of alternative possibilities, just like chemists gave us a surprising discovery about the nature of water. So those are the ways. And this is kind of, in various respects, a somewhat transformative approach in metaphysics. It changes how we would go about finding out which things are possible. It changes that completely. The traditional approach to kind of finding out what's possible is that you basically test whether you can imagine it by trying to imagine it. And if you think you've succeeded, then you judge that thing as possible. And if you think you failed even though you tried really hard, you might judge it as impossible. And that's not a very satisfactory way of kind of assessing what we take to be objective facts about the world. We don't tend to judge other features of the world just by kind of what seems to be the case to us when we think about it. And this approach, quantum modal realism, kind of gets rid of imagination and conceivability as being in the driving seat when it comes to finding out what possibilities there are and what they're like. It puts science in the driving seat there. So if you want to know what possibilities there are, just go and do more science. If you want to know what possibilities there are for kind of universes with different physical constants from our own, you might want to do early universe physics or cosmology. If you want to know what sorts of kind of other species might have evolved on our planet, go and do like genetics and exobiology or something like that. All of these questions about what really could happen are suddenly squarely in the domain of the relevant science. There isn't some kind of proprietary philosophical subject matter that we can think about and make judgments about just by intuiting or just by thinking really hard. And this changes the way that philosophers, metaphysicians go about doing philosophy. One very prominent argument, for example, in philosophy of mind over the last 30 years has been the so-called zombie argument associated with David Chalmers. Broadly speaking, it says there really could be a philosophical zombie, a creature which behaved just like we do but had no inner experience at all. Why do we think there could be such a thing? Because we can imagine it really clearly. So there could be one. So any theory that says there couldn't be one can't be right. That's been a very influential argument, for better or worse. But this approach just completely blocks that. The fact that we can imagine a philosophical zombie by itself doesn't tell us anything about whether it's possible. And so we shouldn't take it as a data point that such a thing is possible to constrain our theories in the philosophy of mind. So, in some ways that kind of blocks off standard argumentative routes in metaphysics, but I think it opens up many more routes than it closes off because it gives us new ways to bring science to bear. So here are some ways in which science might bear on this stuff. So these are all candidates for discoveries of possibility, cases where we kind of, for whatever reason, initially judge something impossible, but then were motivated through doing some relevant bit of science to judge it as possible after all. So, I mean, these can be kind of grandiose or not. The platypus was kind of, I'm told, universally judged to be a fake when it was first brought back from Australasia to Europe by explorers, because it was so obvious that you couldn't possibly have a bird's bill on a furry animal. It must have been something that had been put together to fool people. And kind of along the same lines, Aristotle thought that you just kind of couldn't possibly have transitions between species. Species were of their nature distinct and separate from one another, and one could never just turn into another through gradual changes. But of course, that's now what we think happens in evolution. We now think you can split atoms, but atoms were originally believed to be kind of almost by definition unsplittable. That was a mistake. The world, it was definitely believed kind of an absurd idea for a long time that tectonic plates could move. They only really established that something like 80 years ago, I think. And the idea that space-time could be curved, as it is underneath the Earth with tectonic plates moving, that was something which kind of Immanuel Kant declared absolutely impossible as a matter of a priori necessity. But our best views of space-time now have it as curved. More controversial one on the top right, that's a case where it's claimed that free actions can be predicted in advance by experimenters that have hooked up electrodes to people's brains. The idea is that the spike occurs well before the line, and the line is when the agents report having made their decision. So it's like you can reliably predict the decision to press the button is coming, even before the person pressing it realizes they've made that decision. One way of interpreting that is that we have learnt to reliably predict certain free actions in advance of them being made. That's something that philosophers have thought impossible. Maybe that's not the right way to interpret this case, maybe it is. Landing on the moon, that was thought to be impossible. The moon was just not the kind of thing you could land on. It goes against the essence of the moon. It was a hole in the sky perhaps, or some other kind of thing of a different matter. Either way, not the kind of thing you could actually visit. So I take it that these are kind of cases where we've discovered new possibilities that philosophical reflection, at least up to that point, had not revealed, or philosophical reflection had even tried to actively rule out as impossible in the case of evolution and curved space-time, for example. And there are kind of converse cases that I think are nicely interpreted as discoveries of impossibilities. So One of those is a kind of map of the electron density in an atom. Kind of electrons can't be in the middle of the areas of low density. There's kind of interference effects that just prevent them being found there. Some degree of probability, at least. Black holes. Light just can't escape from black holes. It's not that kind of the laws of physics could have been different and then light would have escaped from black holes. The laws of physics could not have been different in such a way that light could have escaped from black holes. So necessarily, light can't get out of a black hole. That wooden thing is an attempt at a perpetual motion machine. It doesn't work, but it's kind of nice. There's a limit that the Carnot cycle in this one, that's a limit on the efficiency of operation of a heat engine. So the limit to how much work you can get out of an engine like that, and no amount of designing the engine more efficiently is going to enable you to beat that limit reliably. And this is just relativity. The speed of light places a limit. You can't communicate faster than the speed of light. As far as we know, that is still an absolute prohibition imposed by current physics. It's something that you just can't do. And physics has told us you just can't do it. So on this sort of view, hopefully it will have become clear the kind of role of science and physics in particular in determining what's possible and impossible is vastly greater and more extensive than it was on the view where philosophy is basic and metaphysics and people like me, metaphysicians, trying to work out what they can imagine or not. That is the arbiter of being possible. I think a picture where science has this sort of extensive involvement is just much more plausible, and I invite you to agree, but we'll see. So I'm going to talk a bit about causation, not for long because I want to get on to the puzzle to finish with. But I want to contrast two kinds of explanations. Explanations that are about worlds as a whole, or about whole collections of worlds, and explanations that go on inside the world. So there's some answers that it seems like, some questions that it seems like can be answered on this view. Why does our world exist? Well, it's a part of this larger multiverse. Why does the multiverse exist? Well, the Schrödinger equation in the initial quantum state determined that it should exist. Whereas the kinds of why questions that we deal with much more ordinarily are questions within the world and are questions about contingent goings-ons within the world. Goings-on. So why did the window break? Here we're talking about the actual window, the one over there in our world that somebody threw a brick at. That window broke because a brick in its own world hit it. That causal relation lives entirely inside one world. And my line is that all causation lives entirely inside worlds. Causation is a matter of in-world dependence. And the kind of dependence it is, I think is very plausible, is a kind of counterfactual dependence. If the brick hadn't hit it, the window wouldn't have broken. That does at least seem to be closely tied together with the meaning of the window broke because the brick hit it. Maybe that exhausts the meaning of the causal claim, or maybe it's closely connected in some way with the meaning of the causal claim. But anyway, it does seem at least that counterfactuals like these help us understand those causal explanations, even if there's room for disagreement about how exactly they relate. And quantum modal realism, the view I've described, can really easily understand the sorts of counterfactuals involved. The sort of approach quantum modal realism has, the fact that there are no worlds with different laws of nature, no deterministic worlds in particular, makes our theory of counterfactuals much simpler than it would otherwise have been. This is a point that Henry made in an undergraduate essay I learned years later, and was kind of told off and marked down by his undergraduate tutor for an obviously hopeless suggestion. But it turns out that I think it was right on track. So bad luck, Henry. But you can give an account of causation on this picture in terms of these sorts of quantum counterfactuals. This is David Lewis's famous counterfactual example. If kangaroos had no tails, they'd fall over. And according to quantum modal realism, what that's doing is telling us the literal truth about some kangaroos, which lack tails and do fall over. And it's telling us that the worlds that have kangaroos like that are closer, in some relevant respect, than the worlds that have kangaroos in them without tails, that by some very lucky freak gusts of wind don't actually fall over because the wind keeps on blowing them upright. It's unlikely that that would happen. Low chance that that would happen, those freak gusts of winds constantly keeping the kangaroos upright. And so that's how this sort of picture is going to support the view that essentially the worlds in which kangaroos lack tails are vastly more probable and fall over are vastly more probable than the worlds in which they lack tails and don't fall over. Something like that. This is where some work that I've done recently with Mike Hicks comes in as well. Sorry, Mike, I've run out of time to talk about it. Maybe you can ask about it later. So I've got two kinds of why questions that I've talked about. Why questions that quantum theory can help us answer. And these are the kinds of things about the actual world that we use the predictions of quantum theory to derive. So we can use quantum models of the benzene ring to explain the stability, its extra stability in terms of delocalized electrons above and below its plane. And we can explain why the electron was measured to have a particular measurement because of we prepared it in a certain way and fed it into the measurement apparatus. That was the cause, and it being measured the way we did was the effect. But there's a different kind of question, which quantum theory on this sort of view is telling us doesn't have any answer. Which is not, why was this electron measured to have spin up rather than not having been measured to have Z spin up? Now we ask, why was it measured to have Z spin up rather than being measured to have Z spin down? And that's a question which has no answer. If you want to, you can say it's pure chance. But it might have been 50% probability that it went up, 50% probability that it went down, and there's no answer to the question of why did it go one way rather than the other. It just went the way it did. There's some other world where it went the other way, and in that world there's no answer to the question of why it went that way, it just did. So when there's something which is a kind of matter of pure indexical contingency, which way it went is not a question that has a good answer. Despite that, we can still give lots of good causal explanations because they have this different form. We identify a cause, and we identify the probabilistic dependence of effect on cause, and then we have a causal explanation. So I've rushed through this section, I apologize for that, and this section is a bit more a promissory note. This is something that's not kind of nailed down yet, but I just want to express kind of strong confidence that this kind of dependence, causal dependence within a world, can be modeled fine using the resources of quantum modal realism. But here's a puzzle I want to end with. This is a puzzle that I don't think can be answered straightforwardly using those resources. And as someone who's kind of used to doing philosophy with those resources, when I find a puzzle that can't be solved with them, I feel somewhat stuck. And I am stuck. So I'm going to say why. So I've talked about these causal whys. And these are basically a matter of counterfactuals involving chances. I haven't told you all the details of that, but if you want to explain why the window broke, you cite the brick that was thrown at it, and it's just a truth about throwing a brick at a window that it greatly raises the quantum chance of the window breaking. So broadly speaking, we're accounting for these causal whys in terms of quantum chance raising. But there's also the kind of whys that I've discussed just now, these unanswerable ones. Why are we in this world rather than that? That's not the kind of thing that has an answer. Once you've specified all of the causes and it's just a matter of quantum chance which way an event turns out. So that's kind of, in a sense, one of the very surprising discoveries of quantum theory on this view. Like, until we got, physics up till 1920 thought that all why questions you could pose in physics were of the causal why form. They didn't recognize any unanswerable whys in physics. There were no kind of why questions to which the answer was just because, or for no reason, or pure chance. But we do now recognize some. And that's something that quantum mechanics has added to our worldview, as well as this conception of worlds as possibilities as parallel quantum worlds. But the puzzle is with these non-contingent whys. And the basic problem is that if you have a situation where there's a necessary connection between the thing that's doing the explaining and the thing you want explained, no quantum counterfactual is going to give you an account of that connection, because quantum counterfactuals are all about contingent connections. So why does the multiverse exist? Consider that question that I posed earlier. And I answered, because of the Schrödinger equation in the initial quantum state. That maybe sounded okay. It's the kind of explanation we may be used to giving in physics. But on this view, the multiverse and the initial quantum state, they both necessarily exist. So the initial quantum state doesn't in any sense raise the chance that there would be a multiverse. There's necessarily going to be a multiverse. So we can't understand this sort of explanation on the same counterfactual model that we're understanding all of the ordinary in-world causal explanations. So we can understand bricks breaking windows and chickens crossing roads and pretty much everything we might ever want to do in our world. We can understand those sorts of causal explanations. But when you start answering these sorts of deeper why questions, why is the whole of physical reality the way it is, that sort of causal explanation just breaks down. And I think this puzzle is actually a general one. I'm going to try and sketch what it is in the last few minutes. So a recent paper of mine called Grounding Entails Counterpossible Non-Triviality. I argued that, have I explained what grounding is, or do I explain it here? Yeah. The word grounding, use it to mean non-contingent explanation for short. Explanation of one non-contingent thing by another non-contingent thing. No, sorry. Explanation where the connection between explainer and explained holds non-contingently, holds of necessity. So the way the argument goes is by analogy between grounding and causation. So it says, if we have these sorts of directed explanations in the non-contingent domain, that guiding assumption, grounding claims and causal claims are so similar they should have the same relation to counterfactuals. But as I've just argued, that can't be the case here, because the quantum counterfactuals that I've described and kind of, I think, made good sense of are all about dependence within a world. They say why they help us explain why the actual window broke, because an actual brick was thrown at it. And we can intervene on those sorts of things. We can decide not to throw the brick, and then the window won't break. And so we can test these sorts of claims, and we can kind of get a handle on causation through our ability or inability to intervene. But the kind of interventions in the grounding case just aren't the kind of things we can do. So here's the kind of example of grounding that physics might want to understand. The idea that the pressure of a gas is grounded in the average linear momentum of the gas molecules. The thought is it's because the molecules have this average momentum that they do, that the gas that they constitute has the pressure that it does. There's an explanation from the collective motion of the molecules to the pressure of the gas. But but this connection is a two-way connection. If you fix the pressure, you also fix the average linear momentum of the molecules. So if you intervene on either of them, you change the other. So we don't have an asymmetry of interventions in this case. You change the pressure, you change the molecular motion. You change the molecular motion, you also change the pressure. So it looks like we can't make sense of grounding in these sorts of counterfactual terms. The things just vary together too closely. The kind of interventions we would need would be impossible ones that change the pressure while leaving the molecular motion unaffected. But there are no such interventions like that anywhere in the quantum multiverse. So the account of possibilities I've offered just isn't going to give us any handle of the normal kind on these sorts of explanations. And I've argued elsewhere that if you try to give a deflationary account of the counterfactuals involved here, you end up just giving a deflationary account of the non-contingent explanation itself. So you end up getting rid of the grounding that way. So I think this is a real puzzle. The puzzle is that we recognize this dependence out there in reality between, say, collective motion of molecules and the pressure. But that relationship seems to be asymmetric, but explanation, so that relationship seems to be symmetric, explanation seems to be asymmetric. So where is the directionality of explanation coming from in these contexts of non-contingent explanation? So I'm going to suggest two places it could be coming from. One place is that we could be inventing it. There could actually be no directionality of non-causal explanation at all. There's no such thing as a successful explanation of the multiverse in terms of the initial quantum state in the Schrödinger equation, for example. We just assumed there was, or we mistakenly thought there was. Why did we do that? Because it helps us. Why does it help us? Because we've evolved to think causally. Why did we evolve to think causally? Because we're causal beings living inside our one world, where all the dependence that goes on around here is causal dependence, and all the kind of important things we need for our survival are the kind of things we interact with causally. You know, we need to get food. To do that, we need to engage causally with the world. We need to find partners. To do that, we need to engage causally with the world. We need to think about causal counterfactuals. We don't need, or at least not so obviously, to think about these grounding counterfactuals. So one hypothesis is that when we came to think about these really hard subject matters, like metaphysics and the kind of natures of, the deep natures of things, we reached the nearest conceptual tool we had, which was causal explanation. But causal explanation, that was a mistake on this kind of approach. Causal explanation doesn't belong there. We kind of brought it because it was the only tool we had, but it doesn't fit very well. And once we recognize it doesn't fit very well, we should abandon it, or rather make sure that we only ever think of it as a metaphorical thing. So really there are no explanations except for causal explanations on this view, but we can sometimes pretend that there are explanations beyond causal explanations, and doing so helps us get a mental grip on doing metaphysics. And John Shaheen has a paper that finds some evidence in linguistics for this view. But I can explain why I think that's somewhat limited evidence later if you want. So another solution is to kind of go the other direction and go expansionist, realist, and say, well, if we can't find the kind of fundamental directionality of these non-causal explanations in counterfactuals, we will just put it in by hand as a basic ingredient of our theory. We say that we just need to assume as a kind of basic theoretical element that there are such things as grounding relations, relations that are kind of like intrinsically explanatory and have direction, even though they hold between claims that are necessarily connected. So on this view, grounding isn't a kind of figment of our imagination invented by metaphorical analogy with causation. Rather, it's a real fundamental ingredient of the world that perhaps a long way down the line might even give rise to the asymmetry of causation. It's something like the fundamental asymmetric element in reality. And the idea behind this would be that if we've got that, we can then do without other fundamental primitive notions that philosophers might have wanted to use in the past, like fundamentality or perfect naturalness. Maybe the lesson of all this is that what we need in our basic theoretical toolkit is a relation of directed explanation that can hold even in the non-contingent domain. There, the thought would be something needs to give some structure to reality at the most basic level. That thing has to have directionality to it. Let's call that thing grounding, and then just go from there and build our theory that way. So that's the very expansionist realist point of view. The causal metaphor solution is the kind of deflationist, anti-realist, skeptical sort of view. And some days I go one way, some days I go the other. And I'd like in the next 10 years to work out, if not work out which one's true, at least work out which one I prefer. So, I'll wrap up. The basic line of thought driving this whole project is that science should have input into fundamental metaphysics. We shouldn't be doing our fundamental metaphysics, or even our non-fundamental metaphysics for that matter, in isolation from science. And if we do take quantum theory seriously as deep metaphysics, then powerful new theories of contingency and causal explanation are on the table that weren't on the table before with our previous package of assumptions. But there's a problem looming, this challenge from non-contingent explanation. I actually think it's a problem for all scientific approaches to metaphysics, not just my own, but perhaps it's especially vivid for my own, given kind of how much ambition there was in the reductive project of quantum modal realism. If there's something major left out of a kind of grand unifying project, that's more worrying than if there's something left out when all you've been doing is kind of small piecemeal projects. So I am inclined to be worried. I do think that there's still a gap in this story. And there's two ways out. I think both could work. They give extremely different views of the nature of the world, but that's part of the fun. So thank you.